Obvious that there's a lot that we need to still discover. And these are very difficult subjects to investigate on an experimental level, and certainly difficult to know what the experience is like for human beings. But of all the things that fascinate us as human beings, there's probably nothing that fascinates us more than the phenomenon of consciousness. And here, we really run into difficulties in being able to study it. And we're really only at the dawn of our understanding of this phenomenon. And so the best I can do today in our lecture, we're going to talk about this, is to look at how neuroscientists view the problem and why the problems exist. So I can give you an idea of how we're looking at the issue, but I can give you very little hardcore data on what consciousness is. And in fact, the first difficulty comes in being able to define what we're talking about. If you can't define what you want to study, that makes it very difficult. So I'm going to give you the definition that neuroscientists typically use, and then I'm going to ask you to focus on certain aspects of it. So neuroscientists generally say that consciousness is our subjective experience or conscious state. So it's our subjective experience of the world and ourselves. And what I want you to focus on as we go on in these lectures is that consciousness involves awareness, attention, and self-reference. Now, we may change this definition as we go on in science, but right now, this is our definition. It refers to an organism's awareness of itself and the world in a subjective sense. As the term is used here, we are implying that it's a cortical process, and neuroscientists do in fact believe that the ability to be conscious is because of neocortex. And that will raise the issue as to whether animals, of course, who have a neocortex, those who do, are also conscious in a very critical way. We have a subjective experience, and we know, and you have learned in this course, that when you have cortical damage, you can lose that subjective experience. So you can lose a subjective experience of being able to see, to hear, to feel. You can lose a subjective experience of having morality. You can lose all of these subjective experiences, and this is why we believe that it is neocortex that is critical for being conscious. Now, there are some rare exceptions. We can experience pain, for example, and that can be felt at a thalamic level. But you need cortex to be able to appreciate the quality of pain. So even in that one old system, which is the exception to the rule, we still ultimately need cortex. Beyond the problems in being able to define what consciousness is, there are a number of problems or issues that need to be addressed in order to understand it. Most neuroscientists and philosophers interested in these questions break it down into what they refer to as the easy questions and the hard questions. My students always laugh because I don't break it down into those two categories. I break it down into the hard questions, the harder questions, and the hardest questions. And I think after having taken this class, you can appreciate how difficult this would be to study. So let's look at what most philosophers and neuroscientists refer to as the easy question. To them, the easy question is identifying the neural correlates underlying subjective experience. Now, why would I call it the hard question? Well, we've got 100 billion neurons, we've got 100 trillion synapses. Identifying underlying neural correlates of subjective experience, to me, is hardly easy. But when these neuroscientists and philosophers use the term easy, what they really mean is that it's amenable to investigation, that it's potentially answerable. So I would agree with that potentially it is answerable. I'm not sure, certainly not in my lifetime, but in many lifetimes it's potentially answerable. So we've made some headway. We've been able to elucidate a lot of information about the neural connections and circuits that underlie our percepts, for example, of color vision. We use this as an example. So we know a lot about the underlying neural pathways, the neural circuits that are involved in complex discriminations like color. In fact, color vision and vision in general, if you read books on consciousness, they will almost always use vision as an example as to how we're understanding these underlying neural mechanisms. There's other correlative data. for example, generated from functional MRI that allows us to be able to see what areas of the brain are stimulated under certain conditions. So, for example, when we speak a word or we think a word, or when we apply morality to moral dilemmas. So we're able to see areas of the brain that light up. But even here, let's step back just a minute, because it isn't just what areas that light up that will be important in eventually being able to answer the question, because it's not just what's stimulated, it's what also may decrease its firing, may play just as important a role in what's going on. So again, we're faced with this issue. Are we going to understand the underlying neural mechanisms that are involved? And it is potentially answerable, and so we should try to do that. So what do we know about this in relation specifically to consciousness? Well, we know that consciousness is actively maintained. And I think this is something I do want you to walk away from this course understanding and knowing. Just like sleeping and dreaming is regulated by the brain in particular areas of the brain, consciousness is maintained because of the stimulation of particular brain areas. And in this diagram you see here, this is actually larger than it actually is, but the core of neurons that exist here in this brainstem core in this area, so it would just be tiny neuronal groups in this area, not this large area, but tiny groups in this area in the reticular formation absolutely are necessary for the maintenance of the conscious state. And there are nuclear groups in this area which are referred to as the ascending reticular activating system. And this ARAS is necessary to stimulate the thalamus and the cortex in order for conscious behavior to be able to occur. And so what you have is that you are not conscious unless small nuclear groups in this area project to your cortex and make you conscious. Now, you have to think about this in a minute. Consciousness is actively regulated. That means that even if information's getting to your cortex, you're not conscious of it unless these small nuclear groups have stimulated those areas of the brain. So this is a very critical point here. Bilateral damage to these areas produces coma. And it would just be these small nuclear areas within this group of reticular formation neurons. But notice that your brain stem and even the brain stem up here, all of that could be intact. So you might be able to follow with your eyes, you might be able to do a lot of things, but you would not be conscious. So this is what happens when a person is in a coma. The decreased ascending influence from this reticular activating system that maintains consciousness. Now, the projections of the ARAS are absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient for the subjective aspect of consciousness. So, for example, an individual could be conscious but not aware. So a person can be conscious but not aware, and we're going to come back to that issue. And again, I want you to think about that when we talk about some clinical cases later. So what is what I call the harder problem of consciousness, and a lot of neuroscientists and philosophers call the hard problem? Well, that hard problem is a lot harder, and that is the question as to why is neural activity accompanied by an internal subjective experience. Wow. Why do we have internal subjective experience? Why do I have a sensation of pink or orange or blue or brown? Why do I have a subjective experience? So philosophers refer to this as qualia, the subjective quality of an experience, for example, the experience of blue. So when you read books written by philosophers, they frame these questions with a little bit different terms, and I wanted to be sure that you knew that. But the same question is, we come back to the same question, and that is, how and why does neural activity generate qualia? And why do we have a subjective experience to the question? Certainly not all neural activity is accompanied by a subjective experience. Now, we know this in general. A lot of things are going on in our brain right now that we have no subjective experience of at all. In fact, probably most things that are going on, we have no subjective experience. But even in terms of cortical activity, we don't always have a subjective experience. So in fact, I believe that a case could be made that far more information is processed by our cortex in a sort of state which is we're not aware of, where consciousness is not involved, than when conscious awareness is involved. And all you have to do is think of yourself driving down the road, going to work every day or whatever you do, and realizing that you'd already passed a mall and you weren't even aware that you had passed it. So it's like you're on autopilot. Well, your brain was taking in the information and making decisions about how you were driving that car. So obviously something was going on. So you're conscious, you're not unconscious, but you're not conscious of exactly what had happened. And this is what I meant about consciousness really involves a subjective experience of awareness, attention, and self-reference. And even when our cortex is active, we can be in this sort of autopilot mode. So given that that's true and we can function fairly well that way, then why is it that subjective experience has been selected for? What advantage does it confer to us to have an internal subjective awareness that we refer to as consciousness? Now, even during anesthesia, for example, you can record from the brain of an individual who's under anesthesia, and you can show that all of the sounds in the room, for example, are reaching the cortex, but the person is not aware of it because their consciousness is not drawn to that. There is no attention or awareness because their ascending reticular activating system has been shut off by the drugs they've been given during anesthesia. But the information is still getting to the cortex. Now, examples can also be given where animals are able to make fairly complex discriminations in the absence of subjective experience. And so neuroscientists and philosophers are very interested in this because ultimately we want to be able to understand why subjective experience was selected for. So let me just give you one example. So this handsome dude is a bufo toad, and he wasn't one of my pets, he was one of my research subjects. And these animals are really quite incredible. They have an incredible little brain. They have no neocortex. So we're going to make the assumption that they have no internal subjective experience of what happens in the world, or of themselves for that matter, okay? This little guy's perfectly capable of getting along in the world. Now, he has those two big, beautiful eyes. He doesn't have any cortex. He doesn't have any discriminatory vision. But what he does have are projections of his eyes to the same structure we have in our midbrain, and that's our superior colliculus. So he has a superior colliculus, and so do we. His eyes, the retinal ganglion cells in his eyes project to the superior colliculus, and from the superior colliculus, neurons are going to project to a nucleus that controls movement of the tongue. So what happens in this little guy is when something comes into his field of vision that's a certain size and moving in a particular jerky manner, he's going to turn his entire body and stick out his tongue. Okay? So he has all that he needs. He doesn't need to have a subjective awareness. And these experiments that were done on these animals indicated that in animals like amphibians, there's very complex processing that's taking place in the retina. Now notice, in human beings, that's not true. In higher mammals, the higher order processing takes place here, and it also is accompanied by a subjective experience of what's going on. He doesn't need that. He has complex processing going on in his eyes. Now, you can fool this little guy. So this used to be the delight of children who would visit my laboratory. My technicians would bring their kids in, and we would take a little piece of black paper and would tie it onto a string and go to the toad tank and dangle a thing like this, and the toads would be jumping all over the place, sticking out their tongues trying to get the little piece of paper. And no matter how many times you did that, they never learned that it was a piece of paper because they're very hardwired. If they're hungry, they will orient towards. Now, you can make the piece of black paper too large, and then they won't respond. And you can make it so it moves smoothly. They won't respond to that. It has to be of a particular size, moving with a jerky pattern that comes into their visual field. But it's not accompanied by this subjective experience. He doesn't have to think, oh, look, there's a potential bug in my visual field, perhaps I will eat it. So he doesn't have this sort of self-reference nor a subjective experience. So I return again. Why do we have subjective experience? Why, at least in humans, for example, is the discrimination of wavelength of light accompanied by a subjective experience of color? There are many philosophers who have asked what I think is a very legitimate question. Could not wavelength be used for discrimination by an intelligent zombie? Yes, I think you could. I think you could design a machine perfectly well that could discriminate wavelengths of light and have no internal subjective experience of it. And in fact, we even know in humans from the clinic that individuals with particular lesions in parts of the higher order visual cortex down here in the temporal lobe can in fact discriminate between different wavelengths of light but lose the subjective experience of color. So in fact, we know from the clinic that yes, you could discriminate wavelengths of light and not have a subjective experience of color. So this is a very hard question. Why do we have subjective experience? Now, I said that I break the problem down into hard, harder, and hardest. So what do I consider to be the hardest question? Well, this is a question that some philosophers and neuroscientists have not directed their attention to, but some do, and I think it's a very important one. And I think the very hardest problem of consciousness is that consciousness appears to be a something that's happening to a me. It isn't just subjective experience in some kind of nebulous way. It's happening to me. And that has, some kind of meaning. Now, we have come to appreciate that this concept of self more and more in neuroscience, both in terms of a subjective experience at the moment. So, for example, my being right here, right now in front of this class, there's a subjective experience I have, but it's in reference to me. But I also have a sense of a me that's historical in nature, and that events have happened to me historically. And this is something, why would this have been selected for? There are many animals who probably get along just fine without having anything like this. Now, philosophers, this is sort of interesting. Daniel Dennett, who I recommend that you read his writings. He has a very different view on some of these things. But one of the things he's talked about is the Cartesian theater, that we seem to have some kind of sense that somewhere in our head is like a little man or woman that's watching a theater where our lives are playing out, where everything that is seen, heard, and felt is being viewed somehow, like there's one area of the brain that's me. Well, we haven't been able to find that, and I'll come back to this issue because neuroscientists are going to frame this question a little bit differently. But this is our Cartesian theater. Now, we've learned, and we've actually talked about in this class, that there are many different areas of the brain that contribute to our sense of a self. So, and let me recommend a book, by the way, that isn't a neuroscience book, but one that is just outstanding, written by a counselor and therapist about how we change and evolve over time as persons. It's very good. It's by Robert Keegan, and it's called The Evolving Self. And it's just really a wonderful book that goes to this issue that we evolve. We are not the same person that we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 60 years ago. We are a different person. Now, in terms of neural systems, however, what have we learned? Well, for example, we talked about how the somatosensory system provides us with feedback from the body, which is important in our ability to sense a self. This would seem obvious, but in fact, remember that individuals who have very high lesions of the spinal cord, who are quadriplegic, start changing emotionally and personality-wise because they lose that feedback from the body. It's something we take for granted that this body is ours. Also, the hippocampus plays a role in our sense of self. Remember, the left hippocampus is involved in processing episodic memory, so memory of events. And the hippocampus is involved in weaving those events into what we call an autobiography. It's a construction. It's a story constructed by our brains that is internally consistent. And when we're confronted with information about some event that took place in our life and it doesn't fit this story, we see the event didn't take place like that. We don't change our story. So this is a construction of the brain, a very critical one. The posterior parietal cortex. We know that the posterior areas of the parietal cortex play a critical role in our concept of a self, because we learned there that there are patients who have lesions in this area who deny the left half of their body as belonging to them. We're going to come back to those patients in just a minute. The point being that there are many areas of the brain that contribute to this, but how it all forms this concept of self, we don't really know. And also, even if we identified every single area of the brain that contributed to a self, it still wouldn't answer the question about why we have a subjective experience of ourselves. It would only be correlative. It would say when we have a subjective experience, this is the neural activity that occurs. But it wouldn't help us understand the connection between those two things. Why does that neural activity generate an internal subjective sense of a self? So I think even by this very short examination of the questions, you see why the questions are very difficult. Very difficult to look at. Very difficult to look at in animals because we can't use language to talk to them. And so we're making certain assumptions when we use animals in this research. So very, very difficult. What I would like to do now is I would like to look back at some of these patients that we've seen in this course that are starting to give us a little insight. And I'm going to tell you some interesting things that we have discovered. So we're going to revisit some of the patients we first talked about in our chapter on agnosias, which you remember means loss of knowledge. Freud actually gave that term to neuroscience and to neurology, meaning lack of knowledge, that they can still see whatever, but they lack some kind of knowledge about what's happening. So let's look at our first one. Let's look at damage to area 17. So here's our cortex. And you remember area 17 is the first cortical area that receives input from the lateral geniculate. And I told you at the time we first covered this that if you ask a patient, and we'll just assume bilateral damage for sake of discussion, if you ask them, they'll tell you they're blind. So the individual is blind. But they're not. It turns out scientists noticed that when these individuals walk near something like this podium, they move out of the way. When they walk next to a wall, they avoid hitting it. Lo and behold, one neurologist actually shined a light in one of these patients' visual field and said, reach up and show me where the light is shining. And the patient said, I'm blind, I can't see anything. And the neurologist said, go ahead, humor me, do it. And the person reached up to exactly the place where the light was shining. These individuals can even catch a ball that's thrown to them, and they deny that they can see. The person is not blind, they are unaware that they can see. Remember I said that part of what we're trying to understand about consciousness, there's attention, awareness, and self-reference involved in this. We don't understand it. We don't know the neural mechanisms. But here's an example which is just incredible. These individuals are unaware that they are able to see. We even now know how information is getting to the cortex to allow them to see. They don't have discrimination. They can't read. They don't have discriminatory vision. You do need area 17 for that, but they are in fact not blind. And if you ask them to hit a button every time there's a light flashed in their visual field, they'll tell you they can't do it because they're blind. And you say, humor me, just go ahead and whenever you guess that there might have been a light, hit the button. They do it with better than 99% accuracy, which is good as any of us do. And so this in itself is just really, really interesting. Now let's go back to prosopagnosia, this condition where you have individuals who have lesions down here in the temporal lobe, and they're not blind at all, but as they look at faces, they can't pick their friend out or their wife or their husband from a group of individuals. So originally it was thought that they couldn't discriminate faces, even though they could describe that eyes were part of a face and nose is part of the face, but we thought that they couldn't discriminate faces. Well, it turns out that that's not really true. If you ask them to close their eyes and imagine their wife's face, they're able to do it fine. And they'll say, oh, it's all coming together now, I can see her. Then they open their eyes, they look at a group of people, and they can't pick her out. Because with vision, they are now no longer able to place an identity with the face. So you see, we're trying to delve into these aspects of consciousness because this is a part of it. They're not blind, but now they can't put an identity with it. And our last case I want to revisit is contralateral neglect. Contralateral neglect, if you remember, was from lesions to the parietal cortex back here on the right, and it causes individuals to deny the left half of the body and the left half of the world. And this is also done in memory. So they ignore the left half of whatever. Well, it turns out that it's a little bit more complicated than that. They're not blind. If you hold up their arm and say whose arm is it, they think it's someone else's. It's just that they deny sort of the left half of their own body as being part of themselves as self-reference. If you hold up a mirror to such individuals and they look at it, they can see things on both sides. But if you ask them to reach for something that's on the left, they try to reach behind the mirror. They're unable to understand that the mirror is a reflection of reality. Now, more interesting, many individuals who have contralateral neglect are paralyzed on the left because of where the lesion is at on the right. They'll deny that they're paralyzed. Even though they're completely paralyzed on the left, they deny it. What is even more interesting is if another individual is paralyzed, they will deny that that individual is also paralyzed. They deny it in others. And it turns out one of the things we've discovered is that there are parts of the brain that, in fact, when we see someone else experience something, there are areas of our brain that are stimulated from that we refer it to our own self-reference to understand what's happening in another person. These are called mirror neurons, and this is one of the areas that appears to be damaged. So the individual now even denies things in another person, even though they can see perfectly fine. So all of these cases are just to give you an idea as to why these questions are as hard as they are. Now, how do neuroscientists view all of this? Remember that Cartesian theater, whether we're sort of viewing everything in technicolor somewhere in our heads? Well, neuroscientists call this the binding problem. And this is sort of a higher order problem here that's related to consciousness. And that binding problem is that not only does everything seem to be happening to me, it's a unitary experience. But throughout our course, we've been talking about how there's all these multiple parallel pathways going up and down the brain. There isn't one place in the brain where all of this comes together. We've looked and we've looked and we've looked. It's clear our paradigm is wrong. Our paradigm is wrong. You see, in our normal experience, we think that all of this convergent input has to go to one place for the experience to seem like it's unitary. But in fact, it isn't. I'm moving, I'm hearing myself speak, I'm talking, I'm seeing things. All of this is going on, and it's all going to different areas. Are there multimodal areas? Yes, there are. But there's no area of the brain where it all comes together yet. What is my subjective experience? That it's happening to a me and that it is unitary. It is an experience which is happening to me. And we yet have not come up with a better paradigm. We have no idea how the brain is accomplishing this. And last, one of the overriding issues is why subjective experience Why is self-reference? Why all of these things were selected for in evolutionary terms? Of what does it confer to us? Does it allow us to have even greater options to our behavior by having self-interest become involved in the decisions that are made? We don't understand why this has evolved or why it was selected for. We try to understand by looking at animals. Do animals have self-consciousness? Do animals have consciousness? And most neuroscientists would say we might not know what their internal subjective experience is, but that yes, any animal with a neocortex has subjective experience of the world. Whether they have a subjective experience of themselves, we don't know. We don't know if it's something about the way our brains are organized that gives us this sense of ourselves. So the best I've been able to do today is to give you an idea of how neuroscientists are viewing this. And we have a lot to contribute, along with philosophers, sociologists, everybody, to this question, because we have this incredibly important clinical material that actually gives us insight into these processes. And I hope you will be stimulated to want to read a lot of the books and everything that are written on this incredible phenomenon that we call consciousness. Thank you.